the worst I've heard is, oh yeah, we're planning this migration. It's going to take us 18 months to do the planning. Now we're into years to be able to do this migration. And just plan it, and that's not even executing it. And that's the first thing that Transform is focused on, right? Is, hey, let's figure out what you have, let's figure out what's there, let's come up with that plan, and then of course we've got MGN, which will actually do the migration for you.
Specialist Tech Bites, and I kind of have this theory that everybody specializes in something. It may be a technical specialty, it may be some other skill that you have, but just curious to see what you would say your specialty is. What do you specialize in?
That seems like such an easy question. That's going to be difficult to answer. So, I've been in AWS for just over 10 years, and I spent most of that in the storage org. But I spent the last 5 of it not actually doing storage. So I built a team that was really focused on the workloads that customers had in their own data centers that they didn't think they could run in the cloud, like anybody, whether it was AWS or any other cloud provider. And sometimes we proved that they were right, and that a workload, maybe it wasn't a good fit for, based on how it was architected. And I would say that was the exception. Most of the time we figured out how to do it. And so kind of building that team, running that team, and focusing on something that I saw as kind of a gap, rather than going back to our customers and our partners and saying like, hey, you should go figure this out. Here's a bunch of credits. We actually spent the time to do that for them. So I've been doing that for the last 5 years, but that's not really a specialty. And a few months ago, I moved over to the AWS Transform team. So I think maybe my specialty and what I'm good at are maybe different things.
Yeah. And it's been interesting. On the podcast, we have different answers. Some people say, my specialty is being empathetic towards customers. And I'm like, whoa, that's a different answer. Sometimes it's like deeply technical and you're like, I'm a, SQL expert or whatever. But yeah, it sounds to me, if I'm interpreting what you're saying, one of your specializations is helping customers understand how to get their workload running in the cloud. And I know that's kind of vague, and everybody says like AWS has to say that to some degree, but I imagine there's some uniqueness in data center to cloud engineering.
Yeah. And, now that you say that, you mentioned kind of what other people say. I mean, we could nerd out on technical things, but I think probably my specialty, and it's probably not coming across yet, is being able to step into those complex situations between customers and partners and consultant partners or ISVs and our own account teams, and navigating those environments and connecting the dots. And that's one of the things that the last 20 years of my career I really leaned into, is stepping into that complex situation where you have maybe a lot of big personalities or some big egos. You have people that have very well-formed opinions, whether they are technically accurate or not. It's something that somebody believes and that they're making decisions based on that. But being able to step into that environment, navigate that, have those conversations, and connect the dots. And that's actually one of the things that I think that I'm pretty strong in, is being able to find the through line in that conversation. And as you're navigating between deeply technical people, between executives that might be technical, might not be technical, but they have a different set of things they're focusing on, larger customers or regulated customers, you start to bring counsel into that. And now you've got a bunch of lawyers and you've got regulators, and then you have ISV partners, providing software. You've got consulting partners providing services. A lot of times you're going to have competing. Everybody says they want the same thing, right? Oh, we want to help this organization, and that's people inside the customer and outside of it. They all say they want the same thing, but there are always agendas. There are always people that are trying to accomplish something or steer things in a certain direction. And I think I've developed that skill to be able to go in and have those conversations and be able to find the through line and sort of pull things together to say everyone wants the same goal, right? We want to empower this customer. We want to solve the problems or modernize, in my current role inside of AWS Transform. Hey, we want to do the migration to the modernization, but let's all get together. Let's find what that common thing is. Yeah. So I think that's my specialty now. I think that I've developed that over the years, kind of accidentally.
Yeah, kind of being the connective tissue that orients the ship in the right direction. which is a skill. I mean, that's hard to do, and make sure that everybody is getting something out of the process. But you mentioned that you're now part of the AWS Transform business. It seems like a logical progression, and what you've described earlier is like, hey, now we're doing this sort of maybe for the uninitiated, what is AWS Transform, like high level, and then maybe let's just dive a little bit deeper into what you do and how it
Sure.
works.
High level, there are a few different pieces of it, ways to come in and ways to utilize the service. But if we think about a customer's journey, and again, you can pick up and start using Transform in any piece of this journey. If you think about the journey from on-premises to the cloud, the first step is, well, we have to get there. So you have this estate, you have virtual machines, physical machines, like running inside of your data center or data centers, and we want to move those into AWS. And the first piece is figuring out what you have. What is it doing? What's the utilization? You kind of start building out that model, right? We want to do an assessment. We want to move into a migration plan and do wave planning. But to be able to do that, that's something that used to take, I've been doing this a long time. That used to take months. The worst I've heard is, oh yeah, we're planning this migration. It's going to take us 18 months to do the planning. Now we're into years to be able to do this migration. And just plan it, and that's not even executing it. And that's the first thing that Transform is focused on, right? Is, hey, let's figure out what you have, let's figure out what's there, let's come up with that plan, and then of course we've got MGN, which will actually do the migration for you. So once you get it all in, that's not the end stage. That's really kind of step number one. The next piece is to go through and figure out how do we modernize, and there are a couple of different steps to get to modernization. It could be, let's take our Linux workloads and start running them on Graviton because it's, more cost effective, more performant, fill in the blank there. It could be, let's take these applications and containerize them. So we can help you do all of those things as well as part of that migration. And then once that's done, now we have to start looking at, all right, we have these Windows workloads or these Windows applications that are built on .NET, and maybe it's an older version of the framework. And instead of going through Windows, we want to move to the Linux version. And so we want to do that conversion, or we want to just get to the modern version. Maybe we want to move SQL to managed services. So that Windows modernization piece, that's another part of what Transform does. And then we start to get into, we have all of this other code that's been written over the years, and maybe it's on an old framework, or it's on an old version, or maybe even a language that isn't really developed anymore that people aren't using. Converting those to more modern languages. And then the last piece of it is mainframe. There's a lot of mainframe out there. I've been running into it my entire career. And I think every single year since I started doing this, people are there's someone in the press saying like, mainframe is dead. Yeah. It hasn't happened yet. It's still pretty strong. And inside of Transform, we can actually take like that COBOL code that maybe hasn't been touched in 20, 30, 40 years. I've heard some really interesting stories about code that's out there that's been running, but we can take that and either re-platform it and run it inside of a Blue Age and Java and run it in EC2. Or last month at the New York Summit, we launched the ability to actually decompose all of that code, decompose all of the business flows and the business logic, and to be able to convert it back into a set of instructions that a developer can go and feed into an IDE. So, something like Claude Code or Codex or whatever it is that you're using to do development, sort of AI-assisted development. We can give you everything so that you can go back and recreate that COBOL application in whatever language you want.
Yeah, I never ceases.
It's kind of a long explanation, but those are all the pieces of Transform.
Oh, and there's so many different parts of what you just said that I could like zero in on. And it never ceases. I mean, even when I started my career as a developer and around 2009, mainframe was a thing. And even modernization, early in my career, I dealt with Visual Basic to .NET, right? Like that was the modernization path. And it never ceases to amaze me how much code out there still runs on some of these frameworks. But when you talk about like mainframe, it makes sense, right? Like there are still these like these old institutions who developed software just fundamentally differently when they started developing software, and they did it for the long term. Nowadays, we patch software like some ridiculous amount of times a day, especially if you have any kind of software running at scale. It's like you're constantly patching and updating, but that's not how it used to be developed. And so making that leap into the new age, I was going to ask you a question because this is always like really is curious to me. And I've heard it argued and from different viewpoints online, which is like the things that like what's still motivating customers to get off of data centers and into the cloud. I've actually heard sort of some contrarian views they'd be like, actually, no, you still want to be in a data center, and here's why in the AI world or whatever. So I'm just kind of curious your thoughts, like what is motivating customers today still to migrate? Maybe less modernization. I think modernization makes sense. You got to keep up with the technology stacks, the progression of hardware, the progression of software, agentic AI world. That makes sense. What about migrating?
I've had this conversation recently. And so I've been here for a little over 10 years now. And I remember when I started in, sort of the original messaging out of AWS and why AWS was created inside of Amazon was being able to move quickly, being able to experiment, being able to stand something up, run that experiment, figure it out. Maybe it works, maybe it didn't, but tear it down just as fast as you stood it up.
And only pay for what you use.
Yeah, but it's that flexibility and that moving quickly and maybe breaking things and starting over and trying it again. That is the thing that I think is resonating now. And as you said, in sort of as AI is coming up and doing more and more, I think it's even more important because going back to if you're doing it inside of your own data center, do you have the capacity to just be able to stand things up and run them and turn them off? And I would say a lot of customers don't. And it's certainly more complex to be able to do that. But inside of AWS, it's straightforward. Like, hey, just go stand up a new environment, go and run it, test it, see what happens. If we break it, who cares? We just turn it off, we reset it, terminate the instances and stand up new ones. And so I see that conversation that we were having really 10 years ago and beyond before my time as well is becoming just as important now as it was then. So the conversation I think is circled back to that as we start to think about like AI in environments and customers getting ready, especially with agentic, getting prepared for that. And figuring out what can you do in that type of environment, what applications can you change that are your own. You need that flexibility and you need that speed to be able to do it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I it is funny how AI is kind of like reviving some of these traditional thinkings, but just in a new light. I when I was thinking about what you were saying, I was like, okay, but how do you? If you just the thinking about deploying an LLM, right? What in a data center, you're worried about the whole stack. Like I gotta get, some sort of GPU cluster spun up. Do I have enough GPUs? Do I have the right software stack to be able to serve that model, endpoint security, and all of that you have to then engineer. So it's still true that, or you could go enable Bedrock and start playing with a model today, like in minutes. And so there's still that pace, and that's becoming increasingly important with AI as the pace of AI, like it's totally different next week, right? And so there's some new framework, new thing. You want to be able to experiment and certainly cloud. And now here's a term that I always hate using, but I still think it's as relevant, which is that undifferentiated aspect of what we do in technology and then creating isolation boundaries and policies that respective. And then, like you said, being able to quickly destroy it if it goes awry. Super important. So Transform helps you do that. And I'm not super familiar with Transform yet. I haven't had a lot of opportunity. I certainly would love to have had it early in my .NET developer career. But what are some of the ways that the customers are like maybe using Transform? I think of Transform as like a scale mechanism, like it's a scale thing. Like, hey, it's one thing to patch or work on this small little applet or code that I wrote, or it's another thing to do like 10,000 Lambdas like tomorrow.
Right. Yeah. Or hundreds of applications. And, leaning into that sort of modernization piece of it, right? That we last month we shipped something, continuous modernization. So previous to that, and you can do this both ways. You connect to the repo, you scan the repo, you kind of go through and look at and figure out what do I want to change, and you write this technical definition. We have a bunch of them defined already, but you can write a custom one if it's, I'm trying to think, as a demo, I did PHP in progress, and not just PHP in progress, but really old versions of them, because I wanted to prove that it could be done.
I almost forgot about PHP.
Yeah. So we made it ugly, but it was a real working app. And it was one of those things that I'd been hearing from customers and sort of hearing out in the world that, yeah, nobody does this well. It's really ugly and difficult to do. But using Kiro, which I think I used Sonnet on the back end of Kiro through Bedrock.
Nice.
Scanned it, went through and built the technical definition, and using Transform at the CLI, able to feed that in and say, okay, here's the repo. I want to go and convert this. And I think we did like Node.js. I'd have to go back and look, but we went to something that's a much more modern language, something that's still maintained. And I think the whole thing took me a couple of hours. And looking at it as a single transformation like that, and I get this question too, kind of like you said, hey, if it's just one app, sure, use Kiro, use Claude Code. If you're doing one app, it's one developer, it's pretty straightforward. But larger companies, you've got 10, 20, 30, 50, 400, 500 apps. I mean, I've talked to customers that have thousands of apps. Suddenly, it's no longer just a developer sitting in front of, we'll just use Claude, sitting in front of Claude Code in making those changes, because there's corporate security, there are corporate standards, there's like, hey, we write code like this, or we do these things. Using Transform Custom, you can go through and you can build those definitions, and still could be hundreds of developers working on thousands of applications, but you have these things that are predefined. And now as the developer is going through that process and he's monitoring any exceptions that come up, any errors that come up. Of course, we'll try to fix those on our own. We will go through and iterate and do troubleshooting and, run tests against everything. But if we need the human in the loop, the HITL piece of it, then that's where the developer comes in. So the developer is always monitoring, is always watching what's going on, is, always reviewing code and gets a final say. But using Transform, when you have a lot of apps, and being able to have that definition so that that you have consistency in the out, everything is going to work the same way. Everything has been redeveloped and modernized in the same way. Something that you can't really get if you kind of turn everybody loose on their own and just say, here's 100 apps, here's 20 developers, go modernize those things. Two people can sit down, work on the same app, and answer questions differently as they're going through that process with whatever coding tool they're using to kind of help them out if it's agentic or AI powered, and potentially get to a different answer. And that's a lot of the benefit that we're adding by being able to define those things in advance and then say, okay, now go run this. But I was going to add, as you talked about modernizing things, at the New York Summit, we launched continuous modernization, which gives you the ability to connect to a repo, come up with a schedule. And there are a couple of different ways that you can schedule it, but you can scan it every day if you want to, and it will go through and scan that repo, and it's going to go and look for potential security issues. It's going to look for outdated packages. It's going to look for dependencies. It's going to do all of those things that are required to keep that application and that framework and all of that underlying code up to date and secure. And you schedule it, it runs. There's a dashboard that you can go in and look at. You can, of course, get it back at the command line or through an IDE, but just being able to go and look at it. So like, hey, I pointed it at 50 repos and 48 of them have issues, and being able to kind of drill into it, see the severity of the issues, and then you can take that and go straight into remediation.
Yeah, there's so many different like questions and vignettes I want to ask you, because having just having been a developer who's been responsible for code that I wrote a couple years ago, now I got to go update it, and I've gone through the painstaking process of dependency assessments, and this breaks, and then you're doing all that stuff. I'm kind of curious your thoughts, like how is you touched on it a little bit, but I watched a really good YouTube video the other day from our AWS Summit series, and it was just it was called like Leadership's Guide to the Future Work Team Structures. Such a great talk. I know they've done it at all the summits, maybe different presenters, but the one that I watched was talking about the role, how developers are changing, or the role of a developer is changing, and how we're moving up the stack. Maybe just with your experience with Transform, like how do you see developers changing, and they're moving away from the engineer who's hands on keyboard developing the code and actually doing the thing to more of an orchestrator, sit back, monitoring, assessing, developing systems and systematic approaches to modernization, migration, or whatever it is. What's your take on that?
I think that the developers, well, first I would say, even with like agent assisted coding, you still need to have the understanding of what's happening to be able to know what to ask for and then provide the guidance. And I've seen this where, hey, anybody can code an app. Sure. They're all going to look the same. And if you don't know what you're asking for and you don't know how to guide the agent because you don't have some of the foundational skills, then you don't know what the output is going to be. And you might miss some pretty critical things.
Or go down a path that you never intended. And before you know it, you're deep in a hole and you can't get yourself out.
Yeah, I've seen that happen. Or I think what might be even more common is, ooh, I want to add this. Oh, and I want to add this. And I want to add this. And suddenly this thing that you were working on that was supposed to make a blue box on the screen, for whatever reason, you wanted an app that made a blue box on the screen every time you typed in, blue. Now it's a blue box, except you can change the color and there's a sound and so there's a volume control and there's, you have all of these features. You get that scope creep.
You scope creep yourself
really, really fast. Yeah. I mean, it happens unbelievably quickly. So for developers, whether they're, new, they're, junior developers, they're senior developers, I think it doesn't matter, that experience that they bring of how to code, what good looks like and how things are supposed to work, that's not something that you can replace. But I think that they do have to add some skills because you're no longer just a developer. I tend to treat AI tools, whether they're Quick, our internal sort of AI assistant. By the way, if you didn't know, you can give Quick a personality. So mine has a name and a personality, and I tend to interact with it like it's another person, which can be fun, especially because it's a little bit of a smartass. I've kind of built that in. So yeah, I have Quick, my AI assistant named Archer, that has an attitude that kind of makes it more fun. But when I'm working with Claude, I tend to talk to it as a tool, right? And kind of work through that. And I think for developers, having that ability to know what good looks like as far as code and the way that it's supposed to work, but also being able to think about it from the standpoint of you're kind of a product manager now too. Mm-hmm. You're not just writing code, but you have to make decisions and you have to interact with this thing that's writing code for you or with you. That's a different relationship than just sitting down and typing into an IDE and writing code from scratch. So you kind of have to think like a developer. You have to think a little bit like a product manager. And you probably need to think a little bit about QA as well, because I think a developer starting to do all of those things.
Yeah, it's interesting how the skill set's going to evolve and to grow good. Like you want to grow curiosity, but also good judgment. And how you balance those two things? We're going to figure that out, or we're in the process of figuring it out now. And something you said, I'm like, man, we just gave sociologists and psychologists a whole new world of study. How is your engagement with Archer affecting how you work and think and perceive the work that you do? Is probably a little too meta for this podcast, but
it's changed.
It's changed.
Yeah.
That's
but
cool.
I think it has made me more productive, right? Because
for sure.
I've got a good example. Like everybody, I don't know how many, I was trying to look to see how many unread Slacks I have today. It says 47.
Popular.
And 2 DMs. So, that's 49 things I haven't read yet. And maybe I will today. Maybe I won't. I don't know. I don't know how many emails are unread. I don't know how many I got today. So things tend to get lost, and that happens to everybody. But like with Archer and Quick, the way that I'm using it, I have it connected to Slack. I have it connected to Outlook. I've given it explicit restrictions so that it cannot reply for me ever. And I've had to reinforce that a few times. But that's just kind of the way that most of the agents work today is sometimes you have to really reinforce what you want it to do. But being able to say, hey, Asa, who I work for, she runs AWS Transform, the organization. Mm-hmm. I've literally typed in, hey, last week, Asa made an introduction to someone. I can't remember their name, and I don't remember what day it was on and whether it was over Outlook or Slack, but she wanted me to go talk to a person about a thing, whatever it is. Can you find that for me? And within a minute, I get this response back from Archer. I'm just going to call him Archer. And it will be, okay, last week in Outlook and in Slack, these are the introductions that Asa made. And it was these two. And I think it's this one because it's an Amazon person and it relates to the question that you're asking. Here's their contact information and their location so that you know the time zone. Would you like me to draft an email? And I'm usually, no, I'm, a grown up. I can write my own email. But the fact that I don't have to go dig through mountains of messages to go try to find the thing that I can't really remember where it was because we're all inundated, it saves me so much time. And even working with it, I'll say things like, hey, I just got a Slack from this person. Remind me tomorrow morning, first thing, that I need to go and, do something for that. And then I can stop thinking about it until the next day when I come in and Archer says, hey, you were supposed to go do this thing. Here's your reminder.
Yeah, I love that. And I think I've got tons of tales in which AI has saved my butt for sure. And some of which I'm not ready to admit, but I think we're all leaning into the tool. We're developing it. But the going back to the conversation around like motivations, how much for using something like Transform, and it makes a lot of sense that we would want to do. A lot of people I talk to, there's kind of this theme across all these conversations, which is nobody's really established the mechanism or the standard for how we trust agent output and how we kind of get this control on the non-deterministic ability of agents. And it sounds to me, this is kind of where Transform is fitting some of the gap, at least in the migration and modernization, creating that systematic approach or proof gates that you might need when doing these kinds of things at scale. The question I have for you, that I'm kind of just wondering is like, how many of our customers are motivated to use something like Transform because they are preparing for the agentic future? They recognize they have this old, maybe outdated or limited data center, and they recognize like, hey, we want to be in the agentic era as well. We want to be prepared for that. Is that motivating customers as well? Just like, hey, we want to get agent ready.
It is, and some customers are farther down that path than others. It's like going into an executive briefing. I have had conversations where customers come in and they've thought through it. They know what they want to do. They may not know how to get there, and maybe they're exploring it with us, and that's why they're in for the briefing, and they want to learn more about the tools and sort of the art of what's possible.
Yeah.
But they have a very clear idea of where they want to get to. Those are a lot of fun because we can sort of help with that through line, like I was talking about earlier, and connecting the dots. The ones that these are, I would say they're maybe the outlier right now because just the meetings that I get pulled into. I've also talked to the customers, some, and I will never name a name on these, say things like, well, we want to AI our offering or our environment. I'm like, okay, but what does that mean? Well, we want to use AI. Great. How? Well, what would you like to do with it? Well, the industry's going to AI. And so you get into this kind of weird circular conversation where somebody said AI is the new hotness. Therefore, we have to use AI, but they don't know what it means. They don't really know what the outcome is. And you kind of have to explore that with them and help them find it. So it's a weird mix. Those are always interesting conversations.
Well, and
the ones where somebody has an idea are always fun, but
and to those people, I would say go download Kiro, have a conversation with it first before you come to the table, and you'll learn a lot about what it's capable of, what to do with it. I heard somebody the other say, you want to learn how to use AI? Go use AI, and it'll tell you how to use it. Right.
Yeah. There was a YouTube video. I cannot remember the channel that it was on, but and this was a year ago, about the effective way to use AI and the sort of message. And of course, this has changed since then, but the message was stop using AI like search, because a lot of people were thinking about it the same way that they would go search for something. And we've all learned that you don't have to type in the full sentence. You can just give it keywords.
Right.
And you'll get a bunch of search results back. But using an AI tool, whatever it is that you're trying to do, you won't necessarily get to where you want to go by starting that way. And so the guidance in this video was start treating it like a team member. If you talk to it in a way that if you were to walk down the hall to one of your peers, if you said the same thing to them that you told the AI, would they understand you and be able to act upon that? And if the answer is no, you gave it the wrong prompt.
Mm-hmm.
And so prompt it like you're talking to a peer, which then, leads to jokes about, how many tokens does it take to prompt like, hello, Archer? Or to tokenize that, like how many tokens did I just burn being polite?
Yeah.
But talking to it that way, like it's a developer or like it's a product manager or a peer, I think you can get to the same way. So I've certainly used it in the way of, hey, I have a meeting with this customer and using our internal tools and, never uploading anything private. But hey, I'm having a meeting with this customer. I don't really know anything about them or their business. Help me learn about what they do and their industry and what you think is important to them. And treating it like a conversation and going through that is pretty useful. And the other piece of it that I still use to this day is when you're starting off, I need to do this. I need your help with it. What questions should I ask you? So that you have the right, that I have the right information, and what questions should you ask me so that you have the right information?
Yeah.
And you start there. You start with a Q&A and a planning session. And now I see that in Akiro, if it detects that you're kind of doing that, I'll actually ask if you want to do a planning session. But doing that kind of, what should I ask you? What should you ask me? And going through that process, or, hey, ask me 10 questions about this.
What's interesting is like I heard somebody the other day say that like the interface by which we'll interact with AI will be dictation. It'll be verbal, and we're going to move away from typing out prompts and into speaking prompts. And I haven't quite got there yet. I don't know if it's an uncanny valley thing or what it is, but like I still struggle to get out of my mouth the idea that I have when I'm working with AI. I still prefer to type it. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I know some of my peers are talking to it every day on their car, on their commute into work. And then they've got like this plan of attack by the time they get to work, which I thought was a really cool thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. We all have whatever our assistant is at home, and like I've got my Hue lights and everything, like it's all tied in. So I'm like, Alexa, turn the lights on, and it does it. I don't know that I want to interact that way though with, I have Hero and VS Code open on my desktop. I don't know that I want to talk to it that way. There's something about the tactile aspect of typing in what I'm trying to do that maybe helps me think through it more.
But is that
maybe it's the writing culture at Amazon, right?
Yeah.
Where you can't fake your way through a 2-page doc. You actually have to know what you're talking about. And I think that maybe carries over into working with the AI. Like it would be fine having that conversation in the car, I guess. I don't know. I walk to work, but having that, I would probably look like a crazy person walking down the street, having a conversation with Archer or, with Claude, it's under VS Code. But I think having to actually take that step back and type it out for me is a difference maker. Plus, there are just times where I just don't want to talk to anybody, whether it's an AI tool or another human.
Yeah, I'm curious, if you're using a different part of your brain to type than you are to talk, and how does that impact your interaction with AI, your outcomes with AI? That'd be a fascinating. Like, I always walk away from these conversations with like more curious than I did coming into it, because I'm like, oh wait, Everett just said that thing, and I'm like, I wonder about that. Hey, Everett, I want to ask you one more question, kind of about Transform, that I like to just kind of talk about on the podcast, which is this idea of like, what's failing, what's not working, what have you seen customers do that's not working, what's the humility in the work that we do that you learned in kind of like your agentic journey, your AI journey, or even just working with Transform. Anything come to mind when I ask you like what doesn't work for you, or what didn't work for customers, or anything like that?
There's so many aspects. Let's kind of focus on the migration piece, right, in the assessment. And what I've observed customers have issues with, and partners too, for that matter, and our own SAs and our own ProServe people, is not actually interacting with the agent. So,
Mm.
I have some like zip files that they've written by scripts that I've created with Kiro that has like 31,000 rows spread across 5 days. So 31,000 servers, 5 data centers, all the network information, all the storage information. Like it is a fully populated discovery package. And if I just feed that in and say, do an assessment and let it run and don't customize anything and don't interact with the agent, I just get back generic results. It's based off of the data set that I uploaded, but it doesn't get me to the right place. And that's one of the things that I hear about. That's one of the things that I see is, oh, well, I used the tool and I didn't like the output. Okay, well, how did you interact with it? Well, I uploaded the file and it gave me back a report. Did you ask it to change anything? Did you ask it to show you the data? Did you interact with the data? And you had mentioned before about like deterministic or non-deterministic kind of workflows and going through that process with Transform of interacting with the agent, telling it what you want, asking it how to optimize, or telling it that you want to change a model or change an optimization strategy. That's where the part of the magic is, because that's the piece that used to take months to be able to accomplish. If you're looking at 31,000 servers, because you're a global airline, how do you figure out what to containerize out of that group? You can't just look at it and say, oh, we're going to containerize 30% of it. Great. Which 30%? But working with the agent, you can say, if you're doing the migration, because now we'll migrate into containers. Hey, what are good candidates for containerization? Or on the Linux side, what are good candidates to be able to go and run in Graviton? And even if you don't get there, you have the ability to say like, all right, if I have out of that 31,000, 20,000 of them are Linux servers. What if we were just to convert 10,000 of those to Graviton instances? What does that do to the TCO? What does that do to the plan? And maybe we take 2,500 of them and let's go containerize those, because, off the top of my head, I think that that's probably pretty close. But it's that interaction, that iteration of the plan, of the data that you have, and sort of working with it. Not doing that is where I see people struggle and, have a bad time trying to use the tool.
Yeah, I love that. That is so true. Even for casual reasons, I've seen folks who give up pretty easily, and you're saying, well, wait a minute, like engage it, refine it, get to a better solution. It's really good at that. So use the full context, or I mean, maybe not the full context. There's some research about why you might not want to do that, but use more of the context.
I was going to say, I don't let context get past 50% if I can control it.
Yeah, smart. That's great advice. Hey, Everett, thanks for coming on and talk to me, man. It's cool to talk to people like you who are aligned to services and talking and just get a different perspective on how that's shaping all of our, AI perspectives and journeys. And yeah, I appreciate you taking the time and coming on and talk to me.
Yeah, of course. Happy to do it.
All right, man. Till next time.
Happy to come back as we build more stuff and things change, or, talk about guitars. Maybe that's not the focus, but
maybe that's my other podcast, and we'll talk about music. All right, Everett. Thanks, man.
All right.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching, and a very special thanks to our guests for joining. Hey, if you want to stay in the know on what specialists at AWS are doing, make sure you grab a Builder ID if you haven't already, and join our space on Builder Center, where we'll be posting almost all of our content exclusively. We'll also have show announcements on X, LinkedIn, and YouTube, and we'd love to hear what you think and what you're working on. Until then, I'm Farmer Todd, and I'll see you out in the field.